Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the use of inserting trims into your designs. Now the supplies that I recommend to have on hand for this type of technique would be a double face basting tape. This one right here is an 1/8 inch wide, and this is my preferred one to use because it is so narrow. It's double stick, and you can place that down in the seam allowance to adhere the trim before you baste or sew it down. This also comes 1/4 inch wide and might be a little bit easier to find, but I do have links for this in the Ultimate Resource Guide. So then along with that, you're going to want some sort of ruler or marking tool so that you can measure out and mark your seam allowance lines for the trim placement. And then beyond that, you're just going to want the fabric and design for the pattern that you're going to work with. So right here, the two examples that I'm going to demonstrate on are the bodice from Cosplay Day Dress, where we have the trim inserted along the princess seam. And then I also have the skirt for Roebuck Bay, where we've used this Clooney trim that's inserted down towards the bottom portion of the dress. It separates in between two pieces of fabric. All right, so here we have that bodice. We have the center front and the two side fronts. And again, the trim is going to be inserted inside the princess seam line. So I'm going to take this bodice center front and I'm going to use my seam gauge tool here, and I'm just going to mark on the front side 1/4 inch so I can see where my actual seam line is going to be. And that will just give me an idea for how much I need the trim to go in towards the center of the garment. Beyond that, whatever is past that marking line is what will show when my seam is opened back up. So I'm just doing this light enough that I can see it to put the trim down, but you will not see this once the seam itself is sewn. Now we have the stitching line marked. I'm going to take my double-sided basting tape and I'm just going to put that just inside those little dashed lines, and that actually marks that for me very visibly. I can just tear that off, and then I will just pull off the paper, and there you can see I have that sticky residue. Then I'm going to take this tiny piece of 1/4 inch trim, and I want this little scalloped edge to be what is sticking out of the seam. So I'm going to place this down on top of here, and I want actually most of it beyond the tape. So the tape itself gives me a nice line to put this down on to make sure that it's even. And then when I flip this over, I can look back for where I had those markings, but if I folded that seam under, you'd see that I have about half of that sticks out. Now in the pattern, we have instructed that you could baste this down. Being that we've used this basting tape, we can skip that step and then simply bring over the other side front piece, and then we're just going to match these up and pin them together. Now I do have my center front bodice has slits into it so that I can wrap this around the shape of my princess seam line. And I do have some of that basting tape still exposed, so it's actually sticking together fairly well. If I was doing this quickly, I could do this without pinning, but just to be sure that this is lined up exactly right, we will go ahead and pin the whole seam line. Then I just take this over to the machine and I'll stitch this down very carefully, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here you can see that is stitched down 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when we fold this open, we have a very nice and even piece of trim that is popping out from this seam line. So then you just go ahead and press this and then continue with your pattern instructions. So again, this is a great technique, or this is a great design idea to add into any design that has princess seam lines or other seam lines that cut into the bodice, diagonal seam lines, umpire waistline. You can tuck in this type of trim to a variety of seam lines to add design detail and interest. Now let's take a look at the Roebuck Bay skirt and how to do an inserted trim separating fabric. So you can do this technique on any type of skirt that you have in a design. If it's just one solid rectangle, you can easily split the fabric and insert the trim. You just want to subtract the amount for the additional trim width that you're adding. So this design for Roebuck Bay is already calculated to have this trim inserted, so the measurement is the proper measurement. If you're going to want to add a piece of 1-inch trim to your skirt design and you're going to split it apart, you're going to want to remove the part that you're adding. So this is 1 inch, but it's going to overlap on each cut side 1/4 inch. So you'll have 3/4 inch that you're going to want to remove from the measurement of your skirt design. And again, that calculation will be different depending on the width of trim, but just always remember to add back in the overlap and just remove the part that's going to be the separation between the two pieces of fabric. So for this design, we simply need to come through, and I can do this right on my cutting board because it has grid marking lines, or I can bring over a tool and mark the 1 3/8, and I could place this down, and with my marking tool I could just do little dashed markings, or I could just use my board, do 1 3/8 and my rotary cutter, and simply separate my two strips. Then I'm going to take this over to the machine and I'm going to finish off the raw edges between the two pieces that will connect. So you can do this with a zigzag stitch, or you can do this with your serger. Alright, so here I have these pieces with my edges finished, and the nice thing about a board like this that has the grid mark on it, I can place this exactly where it needs to be. It's straight. My two pieces are 3/4 inch apart, so when I go to set this down, I know it's going to overlap each edge evenly. Now what I'm going to do for this one, like I did in the other one, I'm going to use this 1/4 inch basting tape, and I'm going to run it along both edges down the length of the entire skirt piece. Then I'll go ahead and peel off the paper backing, and then I'm going to put the trim down one side at a time. I'm going to place this down, overlapping it just the 1/4 inch. It's a little bit beyond that tape, so it will cover the tape and go on straight just along this line. Now this is really easy to do. It almost feels like cheating. It goes on so easily, and I can keep it straight by keeping it lined up with my board. Then I'm going to take this over to the machine and we'll top stitch right from the top side through the trim. So here you can see we have that stitched down. I stitched that with blue thread. It's still barely visible because of the style of trim, but it is stitched just with a little bit of overlap. So now I'm just going to take the paper backing off the bottom portion, and then I'm going to carefully put this down so that I have the trim overlapping on the bottom half. Then I'm going to take this over to the machine and we will top stitch down the bottom edge, and then go ahead and just finish the skirt or dress according to your pattern instructions. You could hem the bottom, you would gather the waistline, and then go ahead and combine it all together. So again, you can see this is a really fun and easy technique to add. You could do this on sleeves, down at the base, around the wrist. You can add a detail to a skirt, sleeve, or bodice using an inserted lace trim.